Hey everybody, it is Nathan Selove with a very special video today. So recently some people that I know recommended that I check out the movie The Mitchells vs. the Machines because of its portrayal of neurodiverse people. And so I watched it and I really want to talk about it because there's a lot of things I want to say about this movie. Now, I am going to try to avoid major spoilers, but I am still going to give a brief summary of the plot. So a brief overview of the plot of the movie. Basically, there's this suburban family called the Mitchells, who all of them are weird and quirky in their own special ways, and we'll discuss a little bit more about that a little bit later. And the daughter in the family has just reached the age where she's ready to go to college, so she's preparing to go to college to study film, and there is some conflict between herself and the father because they've kind of grown apart, and they have very different interests. So in an attempt to mend the family relationship before the daughter goes off to college, the father decides, hey, let's all have a family road trip in order to take her to college. And while that happens, there is a robot apocalypse. So basically the Silicon Valley billionaire guy creates a line of robots that are supposed to act as laborers or whatever in order to basically make smartphones obsolete, make people's lives better, yada, yada, yada. And they're controlled by this universe's equivalent of Siri, who apparently goes completely evil because she's tired of his BS. So the robots capture and imprison all of the humans except the Mitchells, so then the Mitchells must work together in order to save the world. So that's the plot. But I want to focus on the characters. So the four main characters in the movie are Rick, who's the father, Katie, who's the daughter, Linda, who's the mother, and Aaron, who's the son. And all of them are quite clearly coded or can very easily be read as autistic or some type of neurodivergent. The father is stubborn. He has a deep fixation on putting sentimental value into inanimate objects. He views every single problem as just being another project for him to solve. And whenever he sees a problem that he thinks needs to be fixed, he throws himself into trying to fix it all the way. The mother is fairly hyper, loyal and protective of her family, but also has this hyperfixation of the image of her family. So there's this other family in the movie that she spends a lot of time kind of hyperfixating on their family dynamic because she believes that that is how family interactions are supposed to be, and she kind of like freaks out whenever she sees them. Then you have the daughter, who is once again very energetic, very analytical in her thinking, and also very creative. Her big obsession is with film, trying to make movies, trying to do editing, trying to create special effects, and using cinema in order to tell stories. And she's also queer, so some LGBTQ representation. And finally, you have the son, who is absolutely obsessed with dinosaurs. Like, he loves dinosaurs, he tries to know everything about them, all he wants to do is talk about dinosaurs. And one of the things that I think is interesting about his character is whenever he seems to get nervous, he does this hand flappy thing. So if you know anything about autism or neurodivergency, then a very superficial look of all these characters clearly demonstrates a certain amount of neurodivergency within each of them. Now the question is it good representation? Because I've talked about on this channel several times that there are lots of cases in which portrayal of autistics or neurodivergent folk can kind of fall short a little bit. So one of the first mistakes that these portrayals often make is trying to portray autism as some type of monolith. Basically taking a few specific aspects of autism, pushing them all into one person, and then portraying that as being the primary monolith. This portrayal sometimes creates the image of them being emotionless, or having a lack of empathy, or being a complete savant. Now, of course, many autistics do struggle with expressing empathy and emotions, and there are many autistics that are savants. But the ways in which those are portrayed is often overrepresented when you have autistic characters in media. One of the things that I liked about the Mitchells is that they were all very intelligent in their own ways, and they had their special interests that they knew a lot about, but none of them were these insanely smart savants. Now, I do believe that autistics should be very proud of the savants that are within our community. However, it is important to note that not all autistics are savants. Yes, many of us are very intelligent, and in some ways we might know more about a specific topic than our neurotypical counterparts, especially topics that we have a special interest in, but this pressure that in order to be a successful autistic, you have to be this savant level genius carries with it its own problematic parts. And I really did not feel that from the Mitchells. It didn't feel like they were trying to portray a monolith, especially considering the fact that all of them were neurodivergent in their own ways. And sometimes those ways even clashed with each other, which is another thing that I think made it really good representation. For example, the father has an obsession with nature. The daughter has an obsession with technology. Those obsessions often clashed with each other. Definitely two neurodivergent individuals, and the things that caused their personalities to clash were a part of that neurodivergency, and the representation of the ways in which neurodivergence can often clash with their own neurodivergencies was really powerful. Another way that people often screw it up. They often make it basically just inspiration porn. So inspiration porn in the context of portrayal of disabled folks is when it portrays the disabled individual overcoming adversity, not with the intention of demonstrating how they can live their own lives, but as a way of demonstrating to other people who are not disabled, look, this disabled person was able to overcome this, and they're disabled. So you can too, because you have the advantage of not being disabled. So the audience for that is more the non-disabled person than the disabled person. And it also involves them overcoming that barrier with the intention of them appearing more normal. For example, they might portray an autistic finally being able to look at somebody in the eye as being the pinnacle of them achieving their goal. And this is another thing that Mitchells versus the Machines does not mess up. At no point does it feel like one of their achievements is a result of them overcoming or getting rid of something that has to do with a disability. In fact, quite the opposite. It's the neurodivergencies that they have, it's their quirks, it's the weird things that they do that ends up saving the world. In fact, there's even one scene in which they kind of make fun of how ridiculous it is to try really hard to appear to be normal. There's this scene where they're sitting at a dinner table and the father is just like, okay, let's have 10 seconds of just uninterrupted eye contact. And so they wide-eye look at each other across the room and they're just like, yep, this is normal. This is what normal people do. Now, the humor in that scene is not just about the fact that they're people that have trouble looking at each other in the eye. The humor comes from the fact that they're going at these ridiculous lengths in order to try to create the appearance of normality. Which brings us to another manner in which media portrayal often fails the neurodivergent community, which is basically this question. Are you laughing at us or laughing with us? And in this regard, again, I felt like Mitchells versus the Machines did a good job of laughing with us. As somebody who is neurodivergent, I felt like I was in on the joke throughout the entire time. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't mean that it's bad when you take something that's weird or silly that autistics sometimes do and laugh at it. It's okay to do that, as long as the intention clearly isn't about being mean-spirited or about let's make fun of this in order to change the behavior. For example, there's one scene where the son, who is, again, obsessed with dinosaurs, is randomly cold calling numbers that he finds in a phone book to ask, hey, would you like to talk about dinosaurs? And then when they say no, he's just like, okay, and then he hangs up and he crosses their name out of the phone book. They're not trying to say this is bad, this is weird, this needs to stop. They're trying to demonstrate a facet of his personality that is him, that is objectively hilarious. So when I've talked about media representation of neurodivergent folk in the past, one of the things that I've said is that it's important to have actually neurodivergent people as being part of the creative process. Oftentimes when people are trying to portray neurodivergency, they'll go around and consult a bunch of psychologists but not actually talk to people with the specific condition. So the question is, were neurodivergent people involved in the creative process? And the answer is, it seems like it. So in an interview with the writer, Michael Rianda, he was asked directly, hey, a lot of people are reading some of these characters as being ADHD or on the spectrum or some type of neurodivergency. Was that intentional? And he said that it wasn't what he originally had in mind, that it was more he was trying to portray characters that reminded him of himself. He said that when he was younger, he was a lot like the son. And now that he's a little bit older, he's a lot like the daughter. And at one point he even says, so I'm not sure what I have. So he does acknowledge that he probably does have some type of neurodivergency, he just doesn't necessarily know what it might be. Now, this right here probably explains the reason behind the thing that I'm going to criticize most about this movie. One of the things that I get really annoyed with when there are characters that have some type of neurodivergency is they don't just come out and say it. Like, there are so many mainstream characters in TV shows, in movies, that can very clearly be read as being on the spectrum or at least having some form of neurodivergency. But oftentimes they just don't come out and say, hey, this person's autistic, or this person has this, or this person has that. Like Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, or Temperance Brennan from the show Bones. Characters that can easily be read as autistic, but they never just come out and say, hey, this person's on the spectrum. Now, oftentimes these shows do a good job of portraying autism, and they do a good job of normalizing some of the behaviors, but they never tie it to autism. Or sometimes they might even be careful about saying whether or not the person's autistic because they want to have that out in order to make fun of the autistic characteristics, kind of like what they do in Big Bang Theory. However, for the most part, autistic representation within media is one of two things. Either A, they just come out and say this character's autistic, but then they describe that character as if they've just read a Wikipedia page about autism and they keep throwing a bunch of information about autism or random characteristics that might be associated with autism at your face, which is clearly not there for autistics, but rather for neurotypicals. Or they portray a character who can very easily be read as autistic as being an interesting, nuanced character with their own background, their own thoughts, their own personality. They portray it as a person, but they don't come out and say that they're autistic. And that is really frustrating. I feel like there should be like a new hashtag where it's just like, hashtag just say they're autistic. Now, to be clear, this particular criticism is by no means a deal breaker. In fact, kind of none of the common mistakes that media companies make or that media portrayals make of autistic people is necessarily a deal breaker for me. And I think that the fact that they don't come out and say they're autistic can probably be very easily explained with the fact that the person who wrote the script didn't really think that he was writing people that were autistic. He just thought he was writing people that were similar to himself. And he has indicated that he might have some form of neurodivergency, and the fact that he doesn't know what it is kind of means that it makes sense that he wouldn't come out and say, hey, here's the specific neurodivergency that this specific character that I created has. So to be clear, that was not intended in any way as a moral judgment. Overall, it's a funny movie, it's a fun movie, it's entertaining, and it does actually have very good representation. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this is probably one of the best portrayals of neurodivergency that I have ever seen in a movie. And a huge part of that is the fact that they do portray neurodivergency in multiple different people that are very different. And what I think is kind of hilarious is the fact that they manage to better represent real neurodivergent people than any one of those other shows or movies where they spend months consulting doctors and psychologists about what autistics are like. They were better because they were trying to portray people, not a monolith. And that is a lesson that should be taken from any movie or TV show that tries to portray autism. Talk to the people. Involve the people. So if you watch this channel, that probably means that you are interested in neurodivergency and autism and disability. So I would highly recommend watching this movie. It's fun, it's funny, it's got great representation, and it's a family movie. So especially if you're a parent of children who might have neurodivergent conditions, this could be very positive representation for them. Representation matters. And in that regard, The Mitchells vs. the Machines was a breath of fresh air. Well, that's today's video. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a like, a share, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, check out some of my other stuff, and I'm on Twitter now, so you can follow me, @NathanSelove. And if you want to support the channel in other ways, support me on Patreon. And you will see me in the next one.